Yeah, I was just telling Paresh how Neera fooled me into being the moderator here without me realizing this August venue. And sitting there on the sidelines, we almost felt like we're coming here to be performers as opposed to just having a conversation. So I'll pick that up with you, Neera, separately later. So on that note of us being bold, the team for this conversation now is going to be Bold Philanthropy. As some of you know, we at Bridgespan did a study on bold philanthropy in India end of last year, where we tried to define what might be big bets and what it takes to achieve social change in the Indian context, both from the quantitative perspective of how much philanthropic capital is required to look at long-term social change, as well as, more importantly, a lot of the qualitative aspects of change in terms of how large a size of the problem you're aiming to address. Is it really white spaces where you're taking risk as a philanthropist, and so on? So maybe I'll start with just giving a few minutes overview of some of the key findings we had on bold philanthropy. And each of my co-panelists here are very experienced in their own right on collaborations and what it takes to be bold in giving. So I'll then hand over to them to have a more richer conversation on this topic. So to begin with, I'm hoping somebody has the slides. Yeah. So we can move on to click through. Great, thanks. So what we tried to do first is to define bold philanthropy in the Indian context. And as some of you know, big bets in the international context is quite large in values, at least $10 million. And some of the big collaboratives are in fact looking at $100 million type of philanthropic investments for social change. So what we did was to look at almost 100 potentially bold philanthropic initiatives in India across sectors and across geographies.
Sorry, we just realized.
No, please.
And what we found is that a lot of the bold initiatives in India are typically upwards of about $4 million and over a 5-year period. So the two criteria we had was, one, is it really even driven by philanthropy? And we have a lot of examples in India of government initiatives where philanthropy plays a part. And of course, while that is immensely valuable, from the perspective of bold philanthropy, we looked at initiatives that were driven by philanthropic capital, but in collaboration with others. And as I mentioned, more than the value amount of 4 million, where we really put a spotlight was the approach to philanthropy, where we found that most of the bold philanthropists were not just looking at a very tricky and vexatious social problem, but trying to address or even solve a large proportion of it for the target populations in need. And that, of course, involved a lot of times going into the unknown territory. And while risk is looked at in different perspectives in the for-profit and non-profit world, I think here it was a lot about just having that initiative to experiment, to course correct as you go on. And we saw that time and again across a lot of the bold initiatives we looked at. And finally, a lot of them also challenged status quo. So they were brave enough to look at initiatives that have been tried out, not worked, and how they could do it differently. So we also looked at a few exclusions just to try and bring out some of the lesser sung heroes, so to speak, in the study. So we did understand that a lot of the initiatives like Akshay Patra, India's polio drive were immensely bold and successful. But we tried to here look at initiatives that were over 3 years old but have been relatively lesser profiled. So we did have some criteria to look at what are the 8 bold initiatives out of the 100 that we would look at, to also throw light on some of the diversity that Indian philanthropic capital brings in social change. So these were the 8 we looked at, which I won't spend time going over, but any of you interested, I can send you the link to the report. But you will notice that there's a good mix of both domestic, foreign philanthropists, a mix of the amount of capital that has been invested, as well as the diversity in the sectors. So you have initiatives like the Center for Brain Research, which Chris Gopalakrishnan funded with about 255 crores, to really look at fundamental longitudinal research for dementia cure, down to Lakpati Kisan, which is looking at community-based approaches to take over 1 lakh farmers to over 1 lakh income at a level that they would not slip back into poverty. And what we found interesting is that across these initiatives, there were about 6 unique roles that we found philanthropists could play. And some of them are better known, like backing innovation, scaling proven solutions that are well documented in terms of evidence for results. But there were also a few others, like informing public policy, which the annual status of the education report did, and a lot of community-driven approaches that have really looked at high potential for change from within. So I think the BOLD initiative study that we did, hopefully we'll have our co-panelists bring this out from a richer context of each of their experiences as well. And lastly, I think what we found over and above some of the principles to give very well, like having your goals defined, having a pathway to change, we found that most of these BOLD initiatives embodied one or more of these, what we call 3 Cs. Collaborate, which is the theme for today, very rightly so, because all of these have involved some element of collaboration with government, with private sector, co-funders, amongst NGOs, even at the grassroots level, and so on. Course correction, which I mentioned, which is about risk-taking, and initiatives have actually been bold enough to completely switch their business model for scaling. For example, the e-Governments Foundation that was co-funded by Nandan Nilekani and Omidyar Network was initially looking at state governments to actually get their municipal platform taken up in different parts of India. And they realized that that approach is not scaling enough. And today they're looking at a cloud-based national dissemination platform to take it to most of the municipalities. So again, a hugely untested approach. It is to be seen whether it'll work. But I think a key principle there in collaborating and being bold was to be able to experiment and course correct as you went along. And finally, as I mentioned, the example of Lakpati Kisan to actually change behaviors from within the communities, where the communities own the cause and work hard towards the social change that they desire, as opposed to anything top-down or imposed from outside. So it is a very rich array of examples, and I'm hoping this conversation over the next half hour or so will really bring a lot of the real-life examples to this conversation, and of course, being the topic of bold, feel free to be bold and provoke everybody other than me on the panel with very tough and bold questions. So maybe we can begin with a short introductory round robin of just what each of you, from the Skoll Foundation perspective, the Pirimal Foundation perspective, and of course Neera, who you have a bird's eye view of multiple initiatives of philanthropists and nonprofits. What has been your experience of bold? Like, what do you think is bold from the way that you've looked at granting money or nonprofits have experienced receiving them?
So let me take a non-digital poll real quickly. How many people are familiar with the Skoll Foundation? Okay, so I don't have to explain the whole thing, but the Skoll Foundation exists to drive large-scale social change by investing in, connecting, and celebrating social entrepreneurs who are trying to tackle some of the world's most pressing problems. So BOLD for us focuses on organizations or social entrepreneurs who are working to address an unjust status quo, something at the size of the problem. So they've looked, they're not just trying to scale their organization, but they've looked at the total addressable social problem. Take, for example, we heard from Educate Girls yesterday, Safina Hussein. They're looking not just at what would it take to alleviate gender inequity in one state, but what would it take to address as much of the gender inequity problem in India across many places, maybe 40% of the whole problem. So aiming at the total addressable social problem is bold to me. And bold in terms of the scope of that impact. So I'm looking for initiatives and ventures that are aiming at the total addressable social problem.
Great. Paresh, do you want to go next?
Yep. So thank you, Neera. I think thanks to having us perform on the stage. I don't think I would have ever been here otherwise. So I think just adding on to what James talked about, very clearly I think it's not just, as you said, Pritha also, it's not just the quantum of giving that defines bold. I think our ability to really go beyond what the status quo is or what might be the apparent solutions, and I'm saying that it's referred to in the report also, the Bridgespan report, is how does one seed innovation how does one really kind of make things happen in a very different fashion than might have been done all these years. I think also calls for a fair amount of risk capital, a fair amount of gumption to kind of go against the flow, if I may, to take a very, at times, a contrarian approach. The other element I would say is, building on what James said, is really the impact or the size of impact. And I think the term that is getting used more often, which is denominator thinking. And I really would like to borrow from what I heard Nandan Nilenkani say once, saying when you design these, and he was talking in the context of Aadhaar, he said, how do you design something which is internet scale, something which is designed for going global, and then dumb it down to a country level, rather than trying to do it at a state level and then grow it up to a national scale. I think having that thought in mind, and so designing your solutions in a manner that have the ability and the capability of going to scale as and when is extremely important. I would say, to my mind, those two characteristics would stand out.
I mean, I think what's important for us to recognize that as bold as the philanthropy side is, you need an equal amount of boldness, if that's a word, on the NGO or on the implementation side. And I think there's a gap and there's a lag. So you can pump all the money you want and we can call it bold. But as it starts to engage with the organizations in the sector, I think that's really where you're going to have this real change. And so moving from our perspective of bold philanthropy in quantums, I think is really important. And it should be holding us accountable on the bold of the actual outcome. And are we driving that? And then there becomes a time lag between the outcome you've placed and the 5 years you've placed. So there's also that challenge with placing that outcome there. But I do believe to be bold at an outcome level and at a number of people, definitely in India, I think those are what makes it bold. What makes it bold on the philanthropy side is the quantum also. But how much is going to build the capacity of these organizations and building the sector? And what are we building at an aggregate level? I know you say we need to be able to collaborate, but I think that is what makes it bold, is when it's unrestricted funding. And I think we don't do, obviously, enough of that. What is interesting that's happening in India, and I'm going to call it out from the list there, is that you have stated bold philanthropy where trusts and foundations are implementing themselves. And is that really bold? When the Pirimal Foundation is running programs or the Tata Trust is running programs, are we seeing that as bold? And I'm saying it's only bold if it's achieving outcomes really at scale. And how is that inclusive of the rest of the ecosystem, or how is that strengthening the rest of the ecosystem, I think is an important phenomena that we're not addressing or trying to understand. What are the implications of this kind of bold philanthropy moving direct?
I think of this boldness that you're talking about, Neera, as a willingness to put decision-making and agency into the hands of those that are closest to the problem. So I think about, in the case of Skoll Foundation, we give the Skoll Awards for social entrepreneurship. It is a core unrestricted grant of $1.5 million, not tied to a program, it's tied to the organization as a whole. And then we're committed, that's over 3 years, and we're committed to tracking the progress of those organizations for at least a decade and looking for opportunities to reinvest or to bring non-financial resources to them. And that kind of willingness to say, look, the social entrepreneur, the implementer who's closest to the ground knows far better than we do how to drive change on at the size of the problem. So I think about Raj Punjabi at Last Mile Health in Liberia. So at the time that we started working with them, they were, they had pioneered a new approach to community health workers by fully professionalizing community health workers to reach jungle locations that are quite far from health facilities. And they were reaching maybe 300 remote locations. But they had gotten on their own to the realization that even if they spread as far as they could on their own, it would be nothing compared to the 1.2 million librarians that were living outside of the reach of the health facility, and that they were going to have to start designing programs that would go into that white space. I think that's what you're meaning, that reach beyond the walls of any one organization into the size of the problem. And so what attracted us to them was that this was an organization that was not only running their own programs, they were taking direct action on the social problem, but that they were also taking systems action by designing a new national community health assistant program, that they were working with government on the monitoring and evaluation frameworks and the training. And so that attracted the Skoll Award. It also has attracted bold philanthropy from the Audacious project at TED. It attracted bold philanthropy from Co-Impact, which Skoll is a core funder on. But that kind of willingness to put the trust in the social entrepreneur and to let them go on that journey to realizing that their action alone was not going to solve at the size of the problem.
Can I just add to, I think, what both James and Neera are talking about? I think whether it's scale or whether it's, as Neera said, how does it go beyond the foundation and their own projects? I think the interesting dimension that seems to be now coming up, and which a lot of the examples that you have quoted in your report really talk about, is how do we really build collaboratives and platforms that are utilizing the diverse pools of knowledge that exist across these organizations and help the sector go to the next level. So I think when I said denominator thinking, if I have to take an example, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goal targets for in India, for any particular sector, when we work in health, education, and water, if I look at what that goal is, what that objective is by 2030, it's very clear that as Piramal Foundation, we are not going to be achieving that on our own. That's foolhardy to even believe that we can do it. But how do we, based on our learning, and as I said, there are pools of knowledge that exist. For instance, we have been talking, Pritha, about tribal health. There are organizations that are doing great work. How do you really build that platform that brings all these organizations, in a sense what Xerxes was talking about earlier, not just funders, not just implementers, but including government, including all the tech startups, including the knowledge partners, academia, research, to really take it to the next level. I think it's to my mind, a combination, but that is possibly beyond partnerships, the next natural step for taking it into collaborations and building platforms that can really cause the kind of bold impact that all of us are hoping for.
Yeah, and I wonder, you know, James, as you were speaking to, and if we reflect on the Skoll portfolio in general, I think there is a question. Is it bold philanthropy with the organizations after they've achieved a certain level of scale and they have already demonstrated? Are you really taking that element of risk when you're coming in, right? So people would probably say, is that bold? I'd say yes, it potentially is. But it's also the same organizations that continue to get that visibility and continue to get that additional investment. So I do believe there are two tracks to this bold piece, right? There is the track where you continue to invest in these organizations because actually we just need in this country much larger organizations at much more scale, almost at 100 crore level. So there is the need to invest in those that are already succeeding. At the same time, I think there is a need for us to think about how do you build communities, and at an aggregate level, how do we leverage bold philanthropy to move on the sector? I think it requires all of us to stop thinking in a disaggregated way. So you're implementing, and then you kind of move to the government piece, and we're like, that's bold. I'm saying bold is actually being able to leverage the leaders as well as the groups that are around. And this is not necessarily a plug for Dasra, but there are things in the ecosystem that needed to be supported to kind of elevate the entire field to be able to achieve those outcomes.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point because it takes two hands to clap as in anything else. So if philanthropists have to be bold, you need the big bettable organizations or big bettable ideas or approaches to solving it, right? Like whether it's systems level or field building level to actually invest in. And I think there is a big question here, like we heard on the capacity building panel earlier today, how much are the capacities of organizations or different field building entities actually being improved in the Indian context. And I think it'll be a good discussion to have with you all in terms of, clearly a lot of the discussion here is about outcomes, addressing a large part of a social problem, but how do you then build that capacity to address it with the recipient, whether that's an operating foundation, like say the Piramal Foundation, but that said, you all are working a lot with communities as well. So, I think to me, while philanthropists can adopt what might be the most successful way to reach the end goal, and that could be a systems approach, partnering with communities, partnering with government, or indeed making a bet on an idea or an NGO that has the capacity to do it. So there could be multiple pathways. You spoke about the 2 tracks, and there could be more. But the question really is, how do you build that capacity? Because without that, we are really not able to unlock that philanthropic capital. And we keep getting stuck with philanthropists saying, we're making the commitment, but we don't know how to give big in the Indian context. And NGOs saying, so there's a breakdown, because NGOs feel that there is a lot of money, but they're not quite getting that money to improve capacities in an unrestricted and institution building format. So maybe we can actually try and see at that nexus of that almost feels like trust or communication breakdown, if I could be provocative, between philanthropists wanting to give more but not able to, and NGOs which are doing well, want money for capacity building but not finding it easily. What do you all think? What should we do as a country to at least break part of that problem to unlock more giving? Neera, I'll put you on the hot seat.
As profound a question as there can be, as you can see from our responses. I think I must admit that I think at the Piramal Foundation we have limited understanding of what it takes to build capacities of other organizations. And I think James and Neera would be far more equipped to kind of handle that kind of a question. I'm not going to talk about the capacity building that we do within the foundation, because I don't think that's really the objective. I think I just want to bring in a different dimension here, Pritha. I think building capacities is absolutely important. I think what I'm saying is really dictated by both our philosophy and our practice, where we believe that as a foundation we exist not really to create parallel delivery mechanisms, but to really work very closely with governments at all levels, right from a block to a district to a state to a central level, in improving the efficiency of the government system itself. So when we talk about capacity, in all the work that we do, the whole idea is, as I said, not to create parallel delivery mechanisms, but to help governments be much more efficient, utilize that funding that they're putting into their programs a lot more. If I have to take an example, in education, when we work at a district level, we would be investing roughly about, let's say, 3 crores every year in garnering the resources and providing whatever support is required. But if that 3 crores has the ability to impact 300 to 400 crores of an education budget that the government holds by improving the capability and the capacity of the government system, I think that's a huge benefit. Which means we stay in the background, but really provide the tools, the frameworks, the support, not necessarily training, in a manner that can not just create a cadre of better professionals today, but something that can be embedded within the government system. And that's really, in a sense, our theory of how we see capacity building happening. As I said, I really don't have experience of other organizations, but the government.
Paresh, it sounds like part of what you're saying, though, in this relationship to government finance is finding areas where you can create leverage. And so maybe one way to talk about boldness is thinking about where leverage exists and finding leverage where you can. And so, as an example, I mentioned very briefly the Audacious project and Co-Impact. So those are formal funder partnerships where a group of philanthropists have come together. We saw Co-Impact mentioned earlier with the Neelikani family and Gates and Rockefeller and Skoll coming together to make these larger, $10 to $30 million bets on organizations like Project Echo and Pritha in their expansion with JPAL into Africa. And we have the Audacious project, which is put on by TED, but involves a group of philanthropists that are all saying, hey, we will pool together and make larger bets of at least $10 million apiece. And that's landed us on some very large bets of up to $100 million. And we heard yesterday from the MacArthur 100 and Change program. So part of it is finding leverage. These examples of philanthropists working together are, at Skoll, like I said, we can do $1.5 million for the initial Skoll Award, or maybe we might do some, like, Educate Girls is under a follow-on grant right now, which might expand their program to another 5,000 or 10,000 new schools. But if we want to solve at the size of the problem in addressing 40 or 50% of gender inequality in the Indian primary school system, there's no way that a single philanthropic interest can do that. It's a team sport.
Yeah.
We need to team up with as many other philanthropists as we can and find that leverage that's 8, 9, 10x. So I think, but I also see even with Dasra that you're finding leverage even in creating this space, this shared space for philanthropists and NGOs to come together to learn from each other. And at Skoll, we've tried to do that by being not just a funder, but a network and a platform through the Skoll World Forum on Social Entrepreneurship in Oxford each year. So thinking about what are those ways to create leverage beyond your own giving?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that a lot of it is around leverage. I feel our biggest challenge to overcome is how much of the development agenda is being driven by the philanthropists themselves, right? And are they best placed for driving this agenda? And that power imbalance is a real challenge, because ultimately, where the advocacy is happening, where the work is happening, if there's some way to have collective action, collaborative action, where the nonprofits and the implementation side are driving more of the agenda, I actually feel that we will move the needle much better in that. So you've got philanthropists. Even when we did our giving circles, I think the leverage we had by having pooled funding from around 10 philanthropists, and then taking that money and letting the nonprofits be able to implement in an unrestricted way, but accountable on outcomes. But how much we had to say, can we take 15%? Is that okay? Because we're going to do capacity building. And it was really difficult in the beginning. And because it would be one philanthropist in the giving circle would say, fine, then the next one will say, okay, fine, okay, fine, okay, fine. And then you'll hit the 8th one that says, no, not okay. And you're like, okay, okay, fine, from the Dasra side. And so we've come a long way where I think philanthropists are beginning to understand the importance of building that kind of capacity. But I still believe the power dynamics are quite a challenge. And so this pooled mechanism, even for our 10 to 19 Dasra Adolescent Collaborative, when we embarked on this, we wanted to pool with discretion. And that is like the ultimate passion and fun for us was, can you pool money? But USA doesn't get to decide what happens. Neither does the Kiowa Trust, neither does Tata Trust, neither does Pirimal, neither does. It is pooled, and there is one set of actions and dashboarding and outcomes we're working towards. And then that funding comes out, right? So we pool money, and then it goes into these organizations, but it's not health money, it's not education money. And so there are a lot of structural barriers actually on the funding side that if we break some of that down, I actually feel that in and of itself is bold.
Okay, I got the 5-minute signal, so I just want to check, do we have until 3:15 or 3:05?
Then Q&A.
Got it. Great. So maybe before we open up one more round for the co-panelists to tell us more about the unlocking of more bold capital, it'll be great if you all could open your app and go to the live poll. There are a couple of questions around the discussion that's happening here. So if you could start filling it out as we continue the next 5 minutes, and then would love to have a few questions from you all on this topic. So I guess one area of bold we didn't touch upon, or we started with.
100%. Look at this. The room is completely agreed on this one element.
So I was actually going to ask just that before the 100% bar. What do each of you, maybe the two philanthropists, what do you see as risky? So when the poll is saying 100% of Indian philanthropy is actually not taking risks today, if you were to look at your approach, can you maybe give some examples of, have you really embraced risk in any way? And what do you see as being open to risks from your capital deployment perspective?
to me, risk is playing where philanthropy belongs. So if government, for instance, is the greatest scaling partner that exists, philanthropy belongs at the early risk. So I think of, for instance, social entrepreneurship as kind of the research and development of the international development space. And by playing there, we're saying, look, we're going to help you do and improve some sort of innovation in the space and inherit that early risk with you, whether it's piloting a new approach to getting girls into school or protecting communal lands. And then when others are prepared to scale them, that's when these scaling partners, whether they're market forces or government or others, can take on the larger risk in the end. But philanthropy ought to be taking the risk. And then philanthropy ought to be, if we're going to do bold philanthropy, we have to risk, as Neera was saying, like ceding some control to the doer, because they know the communities that they serve much better, but ceding even in our own governance. The complexity for those of us who have been involved in co-impact is that we all have different boards with different timelines for how decisions are made. And you have to cede some of that governance control to say, no, we're going to put our money in a pooled fund, and we're not going to have veto power over every decision that gets made about that funding, which means that sometimes you fund things that you're highly passionate about and are very aligned with your strategic aims. Sometimes you're funding things that you're lukewarm about and they're mildly aligned with your strategic aims, but that willingness to cede some control.
Paresh, I think we have a minute to hear your perspective about risk.
So I think when we talk about taking risks, the first phase of Piramal Foundation, which is the last 10 years, has really been trying out, as I said, new approaches to the spaces that we work in and showing that those approaches can work at scale. So it's gone through the 3 C's that you spoke about, the course correction, and so on and so forth. So I think having done that, one of the, I think, key, I would say almost an inflection point, is now saying, having gone to scale, how do we really, as I said right in the beginning, how do we really build platforms based on this? So if I have to take one example, we've been working in tribal health for about the last 6 years in Araku, something that the MacArthur Foundation supported in the very early stages. That initial pilot, having shown whatever success we had outlined for ourselves in that small space, now has the opportunity where we are saying, how do we take it across 8 of the aspirational districts in creating what we believe can be scale? And from there, how do we then build that as a platform that can help the country as a whole? So roughly about 10 to 12% of India's population is tribal, and this has the opportunity of impacting that. So I think to kind of support that, to incubate that, to work with partners who come with the same objective, but maybe at times different philosophies, different approaches, and how do we come to a common understanding of not just the problem, but the way forward, I think requires a fair amount of resilience, patience, and support. Someone has to bring that. And I think that's where some of our big bets will move to in the coming years.
Can I just add one thing? I think something that is worth calling out, which we often don't talk enough about, is I actually believe if the principals were involved in the philanthropy side, as in those who made the money in the decision making, there would be more bold and more risk. This element of professionals coming in at a certain level and representing principals somehow builds this strange dynamic where if you speak to the principal, they're willing to take the risk, and all of a sudden you've got the gatekeeper, and they're not willing to take the risk, and they're actually driving some of the power dynamic. And so I think working with principals and how they engage representation on the philanthropy side and building the capabilities and capacities and pushing the accountability to take more risk of those who are representing, I think is a really important piece to changing the whole landscape on this.
Yeah. And I think what is interesting even from the risk perspective is that there are genuinely multiple pathways to be bold, right? There's not just one answer. So risk is one element of being bold, but there is other features that a bold philanthropist needs to embody as well. So I know we are running out of time, so would love to get some reflections, questions. Do keep it brief since we have limited time.
Hi, my name is Abhinav, and I just wanted to share what happened with our organization and how bold that particular thing was. So we started in December, a teacher capacity building initiative, and we launched our mobile application, which was the primary thing by which we were going to do teacher capacity building in March. In July, we set up a not-profit, and in September, we had Google. They gave us $1.2 million, and we had only 4 people in the team. They asked us to implement only in Delhi, and we ended up actually implementing that particular solution in 6 states: Delhi, Goa, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, and Goa. And
Sorry, could you get
yeah,
your
I'm
question,
coming to the question. And we have now 100,000 teachers trained on the platform. And now when we are going back to Indian philanthropists and trying to get domestic capital, they're saying, can you do something in Noida just for, like 100 teachers? How do we scale? How does an organization like ours, who has this track record, we are not even 3 years old, so we don't have FCRA money. We can't go to CSRs because we are not 3 years old again. How does an organization like ours, which has in the past 1.5 years given, at least 3 times what we had promised to Google,
Sure.
how do we actually scale? Is there bold philanthropy in the room which can support an organization like ours?
Okay.
Well
So-
pitched.
We've got one question on how does an organization that's relatively new but proving scale. Maybe we'll pick a couple of other questions.
Hi, my name is Sean Sovak, and my question to I'm being told to stand up. My order to stand up. My question for you, some of us have not yet hit the level of the Piramal Foundation or the Skoll Foundation. So, but even as individual philanthropists or aspiring philanthropists, I think we have to think about being bold as well. And I'm wondering if you could comment on what role you think time and certainty should be considered in boldness. Because just working with a few of the impact organizations I have, 1 year is insufficient. 3 year, it's nice, but to me, bold is 5 years. It's 7 years. If you understand the root cause that these people are trying to address, and you put a 3-year window on it, by the time they get the money, you hire a couple people, fail,
Absolutely.
try again, they're trying to get renewals and working on RFPs. So as I think about my individual journey around boldness, not just amount, collaboration, or releasing control, shouldn't I be thinking about patience and time? And I'll draw one analogy. In my business, I'm an equity investor. If I do it for 3 years, that's a loan. It's the lowest risk thing you can do. Equity investing is about 5, 7, 10 years.
Yep,
To be bold, don't we have to think that way?
Okay. One more question before we try and answer some of those.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
I
okay.
can't see anybody in the gallery, so if there is somebody raising their hand, maybe soon after this one, we'll take a fourth.
Hi, my name is Anshul Arora from Advanced Group. I'm relatively new to the philanthropic world.
Yeah, could you
and-
keep it short? I
Sure,
just got the
sure,
5-minute.
Sure. And the message I'm receiving over the last couple of days is the way to be bold is to think top down in a field and to look at levers and gaps, and then to think about capital and capacity building, supporting the kinds of things you talked about, Pritha. At the same time, when I hear the first question, when you see social entrepreneurs who are scaling an idea that may not exactly fit that top-down approach, there's also a clear need for capital for them to do the good work that they're doing. So my question is, how do we think about capital being allocated to these different means? Is it like the private sector where we'll see capital, going into, depending on your risk, return, and appetite, people will self-select into different areas? Or are you encouraging people to do more the top-down relative to what, the kind of the first example we heard?
Got it. So I know we have 3 to 4 minutes, so we'll try and do a quick round robin of just a minute each. I can pick the time question, which is an easy one. So as you saw in our Bold Philanthropy report, and we looked at 100 initiatives, both from the giver and the receiver perspective, you're absolutely correct. It's a minimum, and I underline the word minimum period of 5 years. And even international experience shows that big bets or bold philanthropies rarely love at first sight. It's typically many small bets that all go up into a big bet. So the funder, like in Neera's words, trusts you, supports your organization, and builds your capacity to achieve that big change. Maybe a minute each for the others, and then we wrap up.
I think I would love to just add to what you just said, Pritha. Yes, I think I would extend it beyond 5 years also. The 7 to 10 year time frame is what I would really look at. In terms of outcomes, uncertain. If you are really picking up big bets and really complex issues that we are trying to solve for, I think if I can't show the return in a 7 year time frame, it's at least important to show that there's progress. And what are those interim milestones that we can show progress on becomes extremely important. Many times, otherwise the conversation only revolves around have learning outcomes improved, has IMR and MMR improved, and so on and so forth. I think to get there, there are many milestones that one has to hit along the way. I think it's important to track those and keep talking about those to show that there's progress based on our experience.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I'd say driving measurability, no matter how much you are giving or participating with an organization, should be really encouraged in partnership, not a monitoring, policing kind of thing, but that you're really pushing for measurement. And you know, to Anshul, to your question, we shouldn't lose the fact in this whole bold philanthropy discourse or field approach that there are very dark situations for which philanthropy does need to take risk, right? And not everything is always about scale, but look at issues around LGBT, right? Look at issues around anti-sex trafficking, domestic violence, some very dark areas for which the government really quite hasn't figured it out. So that's not gonna be the way where we're gonna scale. I see individuals being able to play and grow these kinds of gap areas as extremely catalytical. If you come into nascent fields and begin to build them to a point at which it is ready for pivot funding from a Skoll or from a Pirimal, individual philanthropists need to be able to participate in that. But there need to be mechanisms. So Anshul, to your point, and to the gentleman who's looking, your story is totally not original. I mean, that is everybody, every NGO's problem. And to some extent, I'm like, you know, the best will survive. It's just like that in the corporate sector. But the challenge is we don't have enough funding mechanisms that are pooled, that are out there. So you're just left to your own abilities to market, pitch, hustle, and have family and friends or come from a lot of money. But you know, it's almost the same situation in the for-profit side. So you've got to be able to not only figure that piece out, but I think as a sector, we do need a lot more opportunities for more than, you know, individual philanthropy and then this kind of level of philanthropy.
And I couldn't agree more that one of the rational critiques of these really large initiatives is that they're going to favor kinds of interventions that are highly countable, interventions in education, in health, things where the value equation is very clear, that the unit cost goes down. But questions like access to justice are not coming up on the pipeline for these large collaborative investments. So I think that we do need philanthropy to continue to fill in. And I think to the question of what should a young social entrepreneur do or a startup organization, if we're telling you as a group of philanthropists to invest in outcomes, then we need to be serious about that. So as a newer organization, I would say it's impact that leads to revenue, not revenue that leads to impact. It's not, can I have some more money so we can do some more good? It's prove the good that you've done, show that you've had impact, and then go tell us about it. And then philanthropists, we need to respond to impact as a market signal, because these philanthropic markets are not rational, but we need to respond to impact by opening up our resource when we can see that impact is actually happening.
Great, so thank you. I know we've run out of time, but if anybody has any further questions, maybe you can grab us on the sidelines of this rich discussion. So thanks very much. I'm hoping by next year's DPW that if we ask a similar poll question, that meter would move from 100 at least a few notches down on philanthropists taking risks. So not a call to action, but a call for small change at least.